Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handi Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Karr-Petras, and I am back again with Paula Stoddard, who is the creative editor for Quiltmaker. Welcome back, Paula.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
In our previous episode, you talked a little bit about Quiltmaker's background with publishing Quilting Motifs and the variety of books and pointing out some highlights. And today we're going to get into more detail about how to use the book and how to mark and some of your tips for machine quilting. You're a former long armer,
yes,
a professional long armer, and you've also taught a lot of machine quilting classes.
Yes.
So what are some of your tips for machine quilting?
I have kind of 3 or 4 main things that I always try to tell my students or people who are learning to quilt. The first one is relax your shoulders, because we tend to, as we're doing something new especially and we're concentrating and stuff, we get all tight and like this, and then our arms get tight and our fingers get tight, and it just makes it really difficult. And then we get all kind of petrified that we're going to make a mistake and that kind of thing. So the first thing you have to do is take a breath and lower your shoulders and just relax, because this is fun.
Yes.
The second one I would say is practice, practice, practice. I think a lot of quilters get discouraged because they try something twice and they can't do it as well as they think they should be able to. So you just need to practice, practice, practice. One thing that I have found that is very, very helpful is if you find a design or motif that you like, practice it, drawing it on paper several times. Just draw it and draw it and draw it. So by the time you take it to your machine, you're already comfortable with the flow of the motif, and it makes it much easier to sew your motif.
Do you have a recommendation on like how many minutes per day or how many times per week people should practice? Does that play into your practice at all?
I try to encourage quilters to kind of doodle every day. And you know, if you have a whiteboard or if you have, you know, white paper or whatever, is just try to do it a little bit every day and try something new every day. And if you find something that you really like to do, practice it, and then practice it on a sandwich, just 2 pieces of fabric with some batting, and just do it over and over on that. And don't expect yourself to be perfect the first 10 times or the first 20 times, you know, or even, you know, the first month, because it just takes practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the third thing that I always tell my students and quilters that I practice myself is to don't be perfect. Try not to be perfect. I think we get caught up in trying to make the perfect feathers, you know, everything exactly the same. And you can do that, and then if you make one that has a little jig-jag, all you're going to see is that jig-jag, and it'll make you crazy. So I tend to try not to be perfect. I relax, I just go with the flow, and you know, if things are a little bit, you know, your feathers are just a little bit off here and there, it's the way it looks like it's supposed to be that way.
Okay.
And so it just takes all the pressure off, because then you can just relax and enjoy it.
I like that. I like that piece of advice a lot. Okay, so walk us through how we're going to put this book into practice.
Okay. All right. In the first couple of pages, there is a chart that talks about marking tools and different ways that you can trace your motifs and transfer your motifs to your block. And some of my favorite ones that I like to use are the water-soluble pen and the chalk wheel. That's my all-time favorite. And then I also like to use golden threads paper and template plastic. Those are great tools, depending on the motif, the difficulty of it, if it's a simple line, you know, that kind of thing. Also depends on your fabric. If it's a light color fabric that's easy to trace, you know, through with a light box, or if it's a real simple motif, sometimes template plastic is the easiest way to go. So those are what I like to do.
Okay.
So let's take a look at a motif and how I would transfer it. This is a simple flower motif. This is a really good motif for a beginner because it's got a lot of forgiveness. It's very organic, and the curves and the ins and outs are fairly relaxed, and so it's easy to start with. And what
if there is a little jig-jag, you're not going to see it in
exactly,
there. Okay.
Exactly. So what I like to do is I like to trace the motifs onto a regular piece of typing paper, just because I you want to make it darker so that you can see it through the fabric. Right. And, you know, as you can see, I'm not perfect, and I really don't care. So, you know, because it is what it is, and this isn't your final product, you know, the quilting is. So I generally like to trace my shapes on typing paper as I start. Then you can use a light box, and you can lay your pattern under your block, and you can trace your motif with the water-soluble pen. And this is fairly light, as you can tell, because obviously it doesn't need to be very dark. Under the light of your sewing machine, you can see it really well.
Right.
And but always, always test your tools on your fabric before you actually do it on your quilt or your block. Take a little piece of that fabric. This is water-soluble. You can trace it, and then after you've quilted it, you can get your quilt wet. You can either, you know, completely submerge it or spray it really good. I generally like to completely submerge it.
Oh, okay.
And the line will go completely away. So that's the way that I like to transfer. Also, I did this motif in the center, and then I did a completely different motif in the corners. I think we often sometimes overlook different parts of the block. And so I really like this really simple motif. It's really nice for a corner triangle. So I did it in all 4 corner triangles of this block. And it's a really nice cohesive look.
Yeah, it is. Very much so.
So another motif that is one of my favorites in this book is the evening trumpet. We talked about this in the earlier episode because it's got so many nice pieces and parts that you can use in so many different ways in your blocks. And I particularly like this motif here. Often when we think of motifs, we think of them as maybe like filling a space, like a setting square, and trying to fill the space with some nice quilting. But you can really enhance the look of a block with a specific motif. So I use that motif in a nice pinwheel block.
Right.
I think sometimes we kind of think we have to do something in this triangle, then we have to do something in this triangle, you know, make all these 4 triangles the same, and then make the background triangles the same. But this motif is a great way to kind of pull the whole thing together and add movement to this block. So this is one of my favorite motifs for a pinwheel block.
That's great, and it makes you look at the piecing in a little bit of a different way, and the fabric and how they relate and all that stuff.
Right. And again, I used a water-soluble pen, and so when I would be done with my quilt, then I would submerge it, and it would get rid of the blue line that you see.
Excellent.
Yeah. So another great thing in these books, and also we do this often in our magazine, because of space, as you know, space in a magazine is very limited sometimes, is we will give quarter motifs. And sometimes it's hard to know how to make that into a whole motif. So often when you have a quarter motif, you can just take a piece of paper and you can fold it in to make 4 squares, and then you can draw your line both ways. And then you just trace the motif in 1/4. And then you just turn your paper and you can trace it again in the next quarter.
Just line up the dotted line.
Line up the dotted line that's given. There's a center square and the dotted lines. And you just line those up to your paper. And in the end, you'll have traced a complete motif that you can use. And then, if this isn't the size that you want, if you have a bigger block or a smaller block, you can either enlarge it or reduce it on a photocopy machine to make it the correct size. And then keep what you started with, because chances are you're going to want to use it again, and you can put it into your library.
Do you have a big library of motifs?
I do. I have a gigantic library of motifs. Yes, lots of different sizes and shapes. Yes.
Pieces of paper, do you store them all?
I actually keep them in files.
Okay.
I do. I have like block motifs, different sizes, that kind of thing. If I have specific kids motifs, I keep those separate, just because otherwise I just lose them. Right. So it's really nice to keep them organized.
Different types of media that you use, or mediums that you use to
create them? Yes. This motif right here is also, like the other one, is really good for a new quilter because it's got that organic nature. And this is a really nice one to use Golden Threads paper. So if you're not familiar with Golden Threads paper, it is just a real thin, almost kind of tracing paper. And what you can do is, I trace my design on a piece of just regular typing paper, and then you trace the design onto a piece of Golden Threads paper. I like to use a permanent pen because then you don't have to worry about the ink slipping through the paper and getting onto your quilt. A permanent pen, a Sharpie, is what I always use. So then I trace the design onto the golden threads. And then you're going to layer a bunch of squares together. I generally like to do about 10 squares.
Okay.
Any more than that, they can shift a little bit, you know, and so 10 is a really good safe number
Do you pin
to
them?
use. I do. I just take and like pin in all 4 corners.
Okay.
And then what you're going to do is go to your sewing machine, take out the thread, take out your bobbin thread, and you're just going to trace the design just with your needle. And what it does is it creates a bunch of little pin pricks in your design. And that's just a great way to transfer your design without having to trace 25 flowers on golden thread paper, which I have done before I learned this technique. So you're just going to layer them, and then when you've sewn them together, they kind of stick together just by nature of the needle having gone through and, you know, kind of connecting them. Exactly. Yes. Then you can take your, I'll give those to you. You can take your design and you can put it in the center of your block, just like this. You can center it, that's where you want it. And you can either pin it in place, or you can use just a tiny bit of like spray-based spray, and just, you know, spray it down just a little bit. You don't need very much because it sticks really well. And then you just sew right through the paper. And then when you've completed your motif, you can just rip the paper off.
Okay.
Then you don't have to worry about getting rid of the marking lines or anything like that. It's just a different way to transfer, especially if you have a really light fabric and you're kind of worried about marking lines, you know, if you're worried about that or anything, this is a great alternative.
Okay.
So what I think we'll do next is I will go ahead and show you what it looks like after it's been quilted.
Okay, sounds great.
So here's the finished block after I've quilted it with the golden threads paper. And as you can see, it's just sewn down there nice and tight. And then all you need to do is just start peeling off the paper. It's helpful to have a pair of tweezers to do kind of these inner pieces here. And this is a great movie project because you can just sit in front of the movie and peel off the paper. It's kind of like foundation piecing when you take out the paper off of the
Did you ever enlist your children to help you with this stuff? I've heard people make it like a family project.
Not this part.
Okay. Maybe with foundation paper.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, family
definitely.
project. Well, that looks great. And when you're at home, you quilt on one of these machines that we have up here on our set, right? A Sweet 16?
Yes.
And a domestic machine.
Yes. Yes. So another way you can transfer designs is with template plastic, especially if they're a simple design like this. It's kind of a less intimidating way to maybe transfer a design. So you can take a simple shape like this, you can make template plastic, and then you can, like in this 4.5-inch block here, you just take your template plastic and you rotate it and you trace. So that's what I am going to do here. I've already folded my block in half both ways. Then you just lay your template plastic down. And I'm going to center the bottom of the tulip and the top of the tulip, and you just trace around it with your water-soluble pen. And you trace all the way around it, and then you rotate it, trace again and again and again, and then you have your quilting motif.
And the template plastic offers that flexibility when you do want an overlapping motif, because you can see exactly where you're placing it versus if you were pouncing or something through paper that, you know, you'd be lifting it up.
Right,
so.
you can see exactly where you want to place it and do it that way. And it's a great way to do simple shapes. Yeah. So a great way to do borders is also with a water-soluble pen. This is a great border motif. It's a really common motif for especially smaller, like inner borders. A loopy leaf is just a great design for that. And we've included these dots. And that's so that if you've traced your design and then you want to, you know, move it to the next part of your border, you just line up your dots, and that keeps you going in a straight line. So in this border, I have traced it with a water-soluble pen. You can see here it's very light, but you'll be able to see it on your machine. And I've traced the design that way. Also, if you don't, again, want to trace, you can use your template plastic. I've just laid my template plastic down and I've traced the line. I've also traced kind of a center line from the dot to the dot.
I see.
It's kind of a guide, and that's where you'll put it in the center of your border so that you don't start getting all cockeyed.
I see.
So then you can just lay it down here, make sure your dotted line is in the center of your border, and then you can either use a water-soluble pen, or my favorite is a chalk wheel. You just trace your vine along the template plastic. And then you can either freehand, you know, draw simple leaves, or if you're brave, You can just quilt the vine and then just quilt simple leaves, you know, as you go.
Improvisationally.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they're a little more organic, a little more loose. And it's a great way to practice your free motion quilting too, by doing little things like that.
And for a utilitarian quilt that you want to be beautiful, but that you're going to use, any of those little variations actually only add to it in a way if you're not planning to enter it into a show.
Exactly. Right.
It's
Exactly.
great.
It doesn't have to be perfect.
Fantastic. Do you have any other last tips for machine quilting that we can think of?
The other thing that I can think of that's very important is consider your quilt. If it's a kind of a simpler quilt and you want more traditional, denser quilting, then you know you can pick more continuous, more dense quilting motifs for your quilt. If it's a quilt that's already really busy, has a lot of fabrics in it, a lot of things going on, don't pick a really difficult quilting motif because it won't show.
It won't.
You know, you'll just kind of waste your time.
Yeah.
I learned this lesson when I quilted for a friend, and it was a fall quilt, and she had a dark border, and I quilted these amazing acorns and leaves across the border and in the corners. It was amazing, but you couldn't see it.
Yeah.
You absolutely could not see it.
Yeah.
So I wasted all that time and effort when something simpler would have been a lot easier to do.
Well, the
So-
experience fed into your overall expertise, which
Exactly.
brought you here today.
Exactly. So, you know, play around and listen to your quilt and, you know, do what feels comfortable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today and
bet. Thanks
sharing
for
this
having
with
me.
us. Very inspirational and very useful information.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handi Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years.